Hello everyone, this is the Animation Fan 04, and before we begin this video, I just want to let you know that this video is not going to be like my normal videos. Normally, I usually have a script out, or I write my thoughts before I record the video. This time, it's just going to be a vlog. I'm just going to be making an unscripted vlog where I talk about something that happened a few months ago that I wanted to make a video about for a while. The only thing that just held me back was that making this video was like walking through a room with a bunch of eggshells on the ground, because it's very hard to make something like this, since this is not going to be like a video where like I rant about like an episode of The Loud House or rant about a movie or something. It's more so just like explaining why I'm not really a big fan of one of my favorite YouTube creators' videos. Recent videos, that is. But if you do support this vlog and you do enjoy the entire video, let me know in the comments below, because I might do more videos on this in the future. With that out of the way, back in September 2024, there was a YouTuber named Jay Skeleton who made a first in the YouTube Mario community, as he made the first ever Mario fan comic review, and it was a rant on the Three Little Princesses, specifically the parts 2 and 3, not the first part, which was a comic I wanted to do a review on for a very long time. Like, I read this comic since I was in high school. However, what held me back from reviewing it and a bunch of other Mario fan comics that I really wanted to get to, that I posted a lot on my community tab, was that I didn't really know if people would be that interested in checking out videos on reviews of Mario fan comics, especially because DeviantArt is not really one of the more used platforms in social media, as that talent mostly belongs to platforms like YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and probably the list goes on. But after seeing in Jay's video, which just reached 70,000 views by the time I'm recording this, I decided that I would make a review or defense video on the comic and his rant. Now, for those of you who have no idea who the Borgie Man or the Three Little Princesses is, or even Jay Skeleton for that matter, don't fret, I'm going to help you give a laydown of everything. So, if you guys look up a lot of Mario fanfictions on DeviantArt, then you probably know who the Borgie Man is. He joined DeviantArt in 2005, and his early works were just Mario art, with some occasional small comics here and there. But however, all of that changed in late 2008, where he decided to make his most ambitious work, at least for that time, which was a 28-page comic on the Mario ladies, Peach, Daisy, and Rosalina, having a sleepover, and the entire plot focus was only just on them. Not Mario, not Luigi, just them. It was something special at the time, since it was one of the first unofficial Mario comics to use Rosalina, who at the time was only in the Mario franchise for just a year. Like, she appeared a year before the comic was made, specifically in Mario Galaxy, but that was about it. And also Mario Kart Wii, if you want to count that too. But she was only there for a year prior to the comic first appearing on DeviantArt. And it showed that people wanted to give other characters depth that Nintendo hasn't done. Not even with their games, with the exception of course, Super Princess Peach. But that game didn't really sell well back in 2005 or 2006, depending on where you live in the world. Anyways, the reception for the comic was pretty positive, and nearly 9 years after the comic ended, there was a sequel comic, which was again produced by the Borgie Man, or Yves, if you are curious in what his real name is. With the story being much longer, and instead of being a comedy like the first, it was more focused on deep lore into Mario. Well, at least you will be told that when talking to a fan about the comic. The sequel ran from 2018 to 2021 on DeviantArt when I was in high school, and I loved it at first. So much that I considered it better than part 1, and one of the things that helped me get through high school, along with Amphibia and The Wall, which was an NBC game show that I will talk about another time. Anyways, in the summer of 2023, the book was published, and I instantly ordered a copy due to my love for this comic as a high schooler. But once I got it and reread the comic, I went from loving it to saying it was just a good comic, but not great. And over the years, and over the months, and the entire year, since, it was out in print for a year and a half now, I slowly started to not really enjoy the comic that much. Not because of Jay, but because I just started to notice more and more flaws, to the point where I just consider it just a mixed bag in the end. But what I didn't know was that ever since September of 2023, there was a Canadian YouTuber named Jay Skeleton, who's a few years older than me, who started expressing his opinions on the comic, dating all the way back to the fall of 2023, saying it wasn't good. And the more I tried to explain why this comic wasn't good in his opinion, the more people resented him for that. Jay finally made a video, as I mentioned before, last September, and to this day, it is the second most popular video on his channel. Now, I never knew about Jay's channel except for maybe one or two videos about the Loud House, at least prior to the comic coming out, but he wasn't someone I visit that much on YouTube, at least until now when I saw his video on Three Little Princes and started watching all his other stuff. Since I've let high school nostalgia blind me from how this comic is not really as great as it is from my 20-year-old perspective, I decided to take a look at his video, and after seeing his video, I asked if I could make a defense video on my channel, and he happily agreed. Now, before I begin, I must lay down some notes. First of all, this is not a rant on the Three Little Princesses compared to Jay's video. As I said, it's sort of a defense video, or vlog, however you want to call it, on why calling it the worst fanfiction ever is definitely overkill. But at the same time, I have my own issues, and yeah, it's not really that great either. More like a C-tier comic. And I was going to explain why most of the problems Jay mentioned in his video don't really bug me too much, and I have my own really real issues as to why I don't really enjoy it. Also, like Jay said in the video, please do not attack Yves for making this comic. I do not have beef with anyone. Not with Jay, not with Yves, nobody. And like Jay said before, stay out of his business because he may have been resented a lot, but that's none of your business. That's his own problem, and he mentioned that in his video, so just accept that. Anyways, I'm not also going to talk about the first part of the comic because I just want to explain the flaws of the last two parts of it that Jay has explained, why they don't bother me too much, but are still issues that put dent in the comic's quality. With that out of the way, let's get this going. So to all the people that clicked on this video, I'm pretty sure you know what part 1 was about and how it ended. All three of the princesses were stuck in space for a few days, causing Peach and Daisy to start another sleepover, much to Rosalina's dismay. Now, it would have been nice to have a direct continuation of that sleepover in space, considering how I believe that ending was a pretty weak cliffhanger back in 2009. But instead of something like that, we just get a time skip for 10 years later, which is kind of disappointing looking back, I'll admit, but it's not really a big problem. I guess I could let it slide despite me wishing it was just a direct continuation. Anyways, over the past decade, Peach has been hanging out with Rosalina more than Daisy, making Daisy feel jealous and alone as she tries to find new friends, which she fails to do so. She wishes she can go back to the good old days where she was still popular, with her not knowing that her wish would be granted by Master Eldstar from the Paper Mario on the Nintendo 64. And the next morning, she transforms into the Nintendo 64 Daisy, thanks to Retro Daisy, the 1989 Daisy from Super Mario Land, but we'll talk about her later. Peach and Rosalina encounter Nintendo 64 Daisy, and the three hang out together. But while Daisy and Rosalina are having fun, and Daisy's getting finally the attention she wanted, Peach isn't, because she keeps getting rejected to the point where she gets fed up and decides to make a very selfish wish that Daisy would revert back to her past self. So before I explain my thoughts as a whole on this part, I would like to first explain Jay's issues with part 2, and why I kind of disagree with him. Let's start off with the smaller problems. First of all, the story is practically a meta-commentary on how Rosalina became a main character in the Mario franchise faster than Daisy has. What I mean is how, while Daisy has become a playable character in the mainline Mario games, starting with Super Mario Wonder back in 2023, Nintendo kind of rejected her for a while in the Mario franchises by not letting her be in Smash Bros. For the Wii U and 3DS, or Super Mario 3D World, and instead put Rosalina in both those games without her. Back in 2013-2014, people were rightfully upset with this decision, which is why it made sense for Yves to make a comic out of this. Despite this, Jay said that meta commentary doesn't really belong in the Mario fan comic, or let alone in the Mario franchises in general. However, I disagree with him because I like meta commentary. Usually I'm a sucker when people make fun of a franchise, with the exception of a couple of shows, Teen Titans Go. But I feel like it works if they can make some good comedy of it. And they did for the most part, with a few references, with some references here and there. That, and it does lead to some pretty good fourth wall breaks, which I also kind of enjoy. Though thinking about it now, this does lead to one pretty huge issue with the meta commentary for Daisy. While a bunch of people do agree that she has been rejected for a very long time, do you know what other Mario female has been rejected more than her? Pauline. Yeah. While it took Daisy 11 years to be playable in the spin-off games, 1989 to 2000, which was when Mario Tennis, where she was first playable, well, it took Pauline 37 years to be playable in a spin-off game. And as a matter of fact, they had her as a bit of a gag in the first part of the comic. So why not acknowledge the fact that Pauline exists and has suffered more in being rejected than Daisy? It's like stuff like that it causes a dent in the meta commentary, and while it doesn't wreck the entire execution, it just nowadays make the entirety decent and kind of mediocre at worst, when you are aware that there are other characters out there, specifically Mario females, that have been rejected for way longer than Daisy has. And let's move on to Rosalina. Jay said she was pretty useless and barely does anything until like the last 10 pages. And like Jay said, it's not a huge problem, and while I agree with him, this does have something to do with the biggest problem I have with the comic. But I have to save that for later. We also have the fact that it's boring and there's too much filler, and yes, I have to agree with that. As a matter of fact, this might be one of the biggest problems I have with the comic. See, Yves stretches out the comic too much to show Peach getting more and more annoyed that she's rejected, but you could have cut like 10 pages and you would still get the point across much better. Besides, when the girls start to hang out, they first hang out at Peach Beach in the daytime, a fancy restaurant at dusk, and a fancy resort at night, and since all the places the girls go to, it drags on the story, and instead you could have had them going to 2 places and it would have been fine enough, since Peach was already kind of feeling rejected the moment Daisy appeared at her castle with her N64 appearance. What's worse is that Yves could have cut out this filler and used it for more important things in the comic, but once again, I'll talk about that a little bit later. However, this is where we get to Jay's biggest problem, Peach. She's extremely unlikable, selfish, and totally not like her character in the video games or official Mario media. Now, I'm probably not going to make any friends when I say this, but I wasn't really upset by this. No. Now, hear me out. Yes, Mario games do have cutscenes, and some games are more focused on their story than others. The Paper Mario games are a good example for that. But Mario as a whole is not a franchise that is rich in storytelling. Franchises like The Legend of Zelda or The Last of Us have way more cutscenes and have a much bigger story than a Mario game. And also, do you know when was the last time Nintendo made an official non-video game media product for Mario, at least in the Western world, back in 2019? It was in 1994 at the time back then, and where they capped off the Super Mario Adventure saga with a second and final Mario vs. Wario comic. And you might tell me, wait, but doesn't that mean that the comic goes against Peach's characters in the Mario cartoons and comics? My response is, why do you think these fan comics get made in the first place? It's so that they can make their own versions of these characters, and once again, Mario as a whole is not a franchise that tells stories. I'd go as far as to say that 25% of Nintendo franchises have more storytelling and cutscenes in their video games than Mario. However, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm a big fan of Peach being unlikable. But in actuality, she wasn't that bad, in my opinion, until the ending, where she hit Rosaline with a frying pan and sent her flying like she did with Pauline in Part 1. So, yeah, it's kind of the ending that only bugs me, but as I said before, even as a 15-year-old reading this part, it did irk me a bit. But outside of that, because Mario didn't have any non-video game media in 25 years at the time that page was, or that scene as a whole was released on DeviantArt, it's not problematic for somebody to switch up a video game's character's personality, especially when they're going to learn it later in the comic. And by the way, yes, I will review Super Mario Adventures one day, the comic for that, along with maybe the Mario cartoons and the other Mario media, if you guys would like to, because the fact that it took Mario this long to come back with more Western world non-video game media is pretty crazy, but that's only because most of them were given a lot of backlash, and Nostalgia Critic even said so himself. But as I've mentioned before, I used to enjoy this part as a 15-year-old but looking back at it now, I don't think it's good, but it's not to say it's a bad one either. Well, there are stuff in the comic I genuinely enjoyed, like the first act, most of the references made in the comic, and the interaction with Peach and Bowser, as well as some, not all, jokes, and the art of the comic being sincere glow from Part 1 were all good qualities in of themselves. Just because they were good qualities, most of the story just dragged down because of how boring it is. And nowadays, how there could have been things cut out of the story, specifically one of the locations the princesses go in the second half of the comic, as well as the comic not really being special in general, I'd have to give this whole thing a 5 out of 10. But anyways, let's move on to part 3 of the comic, where I actually start to have a lot more things to talk about. So remember that 1989 Daisy that helped Daisy become her Nintendo 64 self? Well, because of Peach's selfish wish, that Rosalina actually warned her it was selfish in part 2, Daisy is now back to normal. But the 1989 Daisy returns and is evil and starts invading the resort. Peach comes back to the resort and realizes that she fucked up pretty badly, and Retro Daisy kidnaps them. And we get to learn Retro Daisy's real plan. See, rather than making her a one-dimensional villain, we get to hear her backstory where she was rejected too, which is another meta-commentary on how Daisy wasn't even playable in the Mario franchise until 2000, which, like I said before, took them 11 years before she was playable in Mario Tennis on the Nintendo 64. And a lot of other characters from this universe called Retro Universe were rejected too. So she wants to get a piece of the future in the Mario universe so that she and the Retro Universe can thrive finally. Now, it's not a bad idea at all to make Retro Daisy an antagonist with some depth. After all, we have characters like Sasha Waybright from the first 2 seasons of Amphibia, and Sunset Shimmer that fall in the same category. The only problem is that they never really elaborate more of it, but I'll explain a little bit more of that later. Instead of blabbering me about Retro Daisy, I'm pretty sure all of you want to get to the meat and potatoes of this. And by that I mean when Daisy learned that Peach wished her happiness away. Well, I would have cared, but instead we have this horrible line, which Peach says while the two of them fight, "You are ruining my life. Why you always have to be so self-centered? Think of me for a second." And that was said by Peach, by the way. So you know what's really funny? In the previous page, Peach learned why Daisy made her wish, and now she's still being selfish. I think it's safe to say that the dialogue is much weaker than the second part. But don't worry, this won't be the last time I talk about this. Anyways, Daisy traps the two ladies in an alternate reality, and by that I mean the events of the first part of the comic, where the ladies had their sleepover. The entire part makes you believe that this was all a dream when we later find out it's absolutely not. It is cool that Yves was able to replicate his old art style with the new one later in the segment, but there were some parts that could have been cut out for sure, specifically the one where they play Dance Dance Revolution. Rosalina comes back from the second part and explains that Retro Daisy is threatening the mushroom world and is here to take the girls home. Wait a minute. How did she manage to get in the alternate reality? That's something I genuinely want to know, even as a 16-year-old reading this. And too bad it doesn't really get explained. Again, it wasn't that big of a problem for me back then, but seeing how much filler could have been cut out from the comic, he really could have used that filler and instead used it to show how Rosalina managed to go back to the alternate reality to save Peach and Daisy. When Rosalina sends them home, Peach has this nightmare where Daisy calls her out for everything she's done in the comic and commits suicide in front of her. Apparently, Jay hated that part, and he didn't even elaborate on why he did, because, in my opinion, this is one of the best segments of the comic. Her understanding of her actions being wrong, as well as having that emotional and serious feel, which is something that can't be said about the Meets Mario's climax, which I'll talk about someday, but in conclusion, the Three Little Princesses had a better climax than Meets Mario's, which is surprising that those words just came out of my mouth, but you'll understand more about that one day. I promise. That and the entire climax was executed very well for the Three Little Princesses Part 3. I'll tell you what, when I was reading this comic at 16, after that page, my eyes were bloodshot open like an owl every night, wondering what will happen next. Realizing that she messed up big time, she tries to apologize to Daisy, and Daisy is rightfully mad at her and gives her a taste for medicine by pouncing on her, then pushing her off a cliff, and continuing to yell at her until Peach says she was selfish. Now, apparently Jay didn't like that either, because this is a lesson Peach should have to learn because of her already existing personality in the games. But once again, Mario is not a franchise that focuses more on a story than its gameplay. So you know what? I don't see that as a good argument. At this point, I just knew Jay was just getting into nitpicking territory, and he was turning into a Mr. Enter where he just hates everything that ain't perfect. Okay, maybe that was a little bit too harsh of me, but you get my point. Anyways, the three ladies finally reunited, and Peach apologized to Rosalina about the frying pan incident earlier. And this is once again another very good segment, and it was executed very well. It's especially satisfying seeing how after this page, the three can finally get along, and the comic can kind of start to get better. Keyword kind of. Then we learn that Past Daisy is not a real character, making the three ladies realize the only way to stop her plans of taking over the world is to kill her, as well as us learning that why Past Daisy existed in the first place is because Peach wished Daisy to go back to her past self rather than her normal self. Remember that, because this will be important for later. Anyways, the three confront Retro Daisy and the battle begins. Also, before I keep going, Retro Daisy says that she would have to send the three of them to a place that's more permanent. Okay, that line of dialogue is a complete joke in my opinion, especially because if Rosalina managed to get to the alternate reality earlier in this part, then I'm pretty sure what's stopping Retro Daisy is the fact that Rosalina has her wand that can literally help her transport from different realities. But that's just all a guess. So find a way to get rid of the wand first. Also, is it just me, or is her talking most of the time makes me think that Anne Boonchoi would pulverize her up in 5 seconds? Because I think it's safe to say that Retro Daisy is not that intimidating compared to other story arc cartoon protagonists and villains. Bill Cipher, King Andreas, etc. I say that because when you're 16 and reading this and never watched a story arc cartoon in your life, you initially think she's intimidating, when in actuality, she didn't really do that much, which is something that I want Jay to talk about, and he agreed with me on. Agreed with me as in, he agreed that, yes, she wasn't really that intimidating. So anyways, the battle begins, and it's pretty decent, again, but Retro Daisy barely does anything intimidating, which is also a damn shame that I have to compare to the chameleon from Kung Fu Panda 4 as a very pitiful villain who that is barely threatening. Like, seriously, the last threatening thing she does so far in this comic is banish Peach and Daisy to that alternate reality, which was like at the very beginning of part 3. Anyways, the battle ends with the castle exploding and the girls in their mini forms. Now, I'll give it credit referencing what happens in the late 80s and early 90s games, where if you get hit by an enemy, even if you have a power-up, you resort to being tiny. But I still feel like you could have put them in big forms and cut off the next scene Sorry, I'm getting a little tongue-tied. You could have you could have left them in their big forms, and you can cut off the remaining parts of the battle because this next part is pretty unnecessary. Because apparently most of Retro Daisy's minions are still alive, despite how they probably should have died from the explosion if the girls turned tiny. So why didn't Yves have the girls just be in their super forms instead after the explosion? It would be better because it would cut off more filler, so we could have scenes that would actually be better for this comic, like more lore about Retro Daisy or how Rosaline went into the alternate reality. Not only that, but we wouldn't have to get that Princess Carambola scene, because while I will admit, it's not something that gets on my nerves, not even today, though if you genuinely hated this part, I would have understood you loud and clear. I still feel like it was only there just to pad out the battle to make it more intense, which again is another problem I'll get to at the end of the comic. And like I said before, you could have left them out still being big, even without their power-ups, and you could have left all the minions dying in the explosion, and you could have just had them go toe-to-toe with her. It would have cut out a lot more time, and you could have used it for other stuff. But you know what? I wasn't there. But still. Also, there are some lines from Steven Universe Retro Daisy says while Princess Carambola appears, which is also something that has to do with my biggest problem with the comic, which I'll talk about shortly. Yeah, I know I'm hyping this up, but this is really important for later, so all of you should remember this. Anyways, Princess Carambola gets reverted back to normal, and Retro Daisy shows up with a Retro Zapper, which turns Peach into her 80s self. And initially, I thought this battle was just going to keep going and going since Retro Daisy never runs out of weapons. But then I saw the next page and I immediately realized we're in the endgame. Rosalina was also affected by the Zapper, and because she wasn't around in the 80s Mario's games, she slowly starts dying. Daisy yells at her retro counterpart and says she's nothing, and then we get this piece of dialogue. No, I am not nothing. I am your past. You never hear a word I am saying. Okay, so I know we did get her one scene with her letting out all her emotions early in part 3. But really, you never hear a word I am saying? She only got a chance to speak to you once in the comic, and you're literally going to respond with saying she never hears a word you're saying? You see why a lot of these parts could have been cut out? It's like he wanted to give her more of an arc, but thought that one page is enough for people to understand this character. I mean, some readers do, but if others don't, it's for a good reason, because she never really got a chance to speak her mind with the exception of that one page. Okay, she will say some more stuff later, but that just makes this ending more and more debatable in my opinion, which I'll talk about in a moment. Peach gives Daisy a fire flower to kill Retro Daisy, and I just love Retro Daisy's face before the next page. It's almost as if Yves would have made her say, "Fool, you cannot stop a god," or "Come at me, bro, come at me." Anyways, Daisy almost kills her retro counterpart, but stops, to which Retro Daisy forms a black hole, saying if she's dying, the kingdom is going with her, as well as her saying, "This is what we do, Daisy, you and me, bringing nothing but desalination around us, forever destined to be alone. This is what we are." Okay, this is another line that gives her more depth, but let's face it, we all thought she was going to die. Like, that makes the most sense for her to be killed off like some sort of Disney Renaissance death. Well, no. She actually gets redeemed, and this is where one of my biggest problems comes into play. Retro Daisy should not have been redeemed. Now, I understand we had that page and a half of Retro Daisy giving her backstory, as well as that one line near the end of the comic, and a lot of people will understand her backstory very well as to why she should be redeemed, but I'm sorry. A lot of these redeemed antagonists from the story arc showed much more good or much more depth before they were redeemed. I mean, take a look at Sasha Waybright from Amphibia. Yes, a bunch of people think that Sasha was never a good character and was always a villain up until season 3. But that's not really true, because we see a lot of good acts she has done. She sacrificed herself to save Anne in Reunion. She genuinely cared about Anne and Marcy throughout her whole life. She was friends with them, whether it was on Earth or during the first 2 seasons of Amphibia. And she had moments where she showed her good side, like in Battle of the Bands or The Dinner. I would explain more on why she's not really a villain and more so an anti-hero, but there's a video I think that explains it perfectly that I'll just link into the description so we don't get off topic. But my point is, what does Retro Daisy have that should make her a deemed antagonist because of her backstory? Because it's just that she at least had a backstory, and that's better than no backstory. Well, I mean, it is something that could redeem her, but you have to do way more than just giving her a backstory in order for her to be redeemed. And I don't mean saying she's not a real person for it to count as her deserving to be redeemed. Yes, I understand some people think it's enough because that backstory implies a lot, but just because it implied a lot doesn't mean it's enough for everyone to be satisfied that this was a good idea. Because when you give your characters a lot less time to show their good side or their backstory, the less of a chance you have of making people think that she should be redeemed. And I don't care if you didn't want to kill Retro Daisy, because you would scar all the kids under 11 reading this. Like Rosalina said, Retro Daisy didn't exist, so what's wrong with killing her? Anyways, Daisy converts to True Daisy, which is having her same skin in the N64 games, but having the same dress as the GameCube and onwards games. Now, technically, Daisy didn't absorb Retro Daisy's powers, so she's not going to become a villain. I guess that's somewhat fine by me, but I'm pretty sure we would have all preferred it if Retro Daisy just died instead of the two becoming one again. The ladies later have a sleepover and everything goes right with the three of them getting along. And Daisy learns that she doesn't need to feel rejected at all and grateful for the events she is in. And then gets invited finally into Smash Bros. Ultimate. Once again, it depends on if you think it was worth it for her to learn this lesson. Because yes, there are some people that believe Daisy was a reject before Smash Ultimate and Mario Wonder. But then there's obviously the other group of fans who thinks she's not rejected because Pauline had it much worse. Although I will admit the Smash Bros. Ultimate ending was pretty good. However, there's still more to this comic. Yep, we have one final page of Rosalina making a shrine of past Daisy 2. The N64 one. I guess to worship her, which leads to what I consider to be one of my bigger problems with the comic, but not the biggest one. You see, if you read the entirety of Part 2, you may have noticed there's this gag with Rosalina being in love with the classic N64 Daisy, and this gag wasn't that funny to me, not even at 14 years old. But I brushed past it because, well, it's only for the comic, so it's not going to be in Yves layer drawings of Mario, right? Well, I was wrong. Beyond wrong, in fact. We still have a bunch of photos of classic Daisy and Rosalina hanging out, showing some LGBTQ ship that is just so unnecessary. However, despite Jay explaining this was a toxic relationship throughout the comic, I just think we could have cut this page out, since I just think it was unnecessary to add that, and we definitely could have used this page for something better. Overall, even though Jay hated Part 3 more than Part 2, I think Part 3 is the better part of the two. Because unlike Part 2 where after the first half, it's just the same old formula of the girls going somewhere, Daisy getting the attention she deserves, and Peach getting annoyed, and it rinse and repeat until the ending. In Part 3, more stuff happens, and there are more good things that happen in 3 than 2, like the reconciliation scene, the scene where Daisy confronts Peach for her actions, and the dream sequence are all really great moments. However, the rest of the comic has good ideas, but most of them are executed okay at best to very poorly at worst. Outside of that, there is just too much filler in this part, so I'd have to give it a 6 out of 10. And also, unlike part 2, where it's a shaky 5 teetering on a 4, part 3 is a very solid 6 out of 10. And I'm probably not going to change my opinions on it in the future. Anyways, that's all for this video. See you guys in the next... Wait a second. I just realized I have to tell you what's my biggest problem with the comic. But before I tell you what my problem is, I think I need to give you a little bit of an understanding of the animation industry, so that we can compare it to this comic. Trust me, you'll understand what I'm talking about soon. Now, I like to divide animation productions into 3 different groups: short films, television productions, and feature films. As for someone that took an animation class in college, I think it's worth it to bring up what are the most expensive productions in each of those fields so that we can compare them to this comic. Let's go. The most expensive short film series is the Tom and Jerry shorts from the 40s, which had a budget of $50,000 per short film, which is between $600,000 and $1.1 million in today's money. The most expensive television production can differ, since I like to split them up into 3 other segments: children's television, retro animation, and regular animation. The most expensive children's television production would have to be Invader Zim, which had a budget of $1.2 million per half hour. As for the most expensive television animation of the Bronze Age of animation, I should say it is How the Grinch Stole Christmas, with a budget of $315,000 back in 1966, or $3 million in today's money. Then, for the most expensive animated show in general, it's Arcane with a budget of $14 million per episode. Finally, the most expensive animated theatrical feature film is the 2010 film Tangled, with a budget of $260 million. At this point, I know what you're thinking. Why are you talking about all these animations and their budgets in a video where you're talking about a review for a comic? Well, the answer is simple. If you take an independent comic like this one, you would probably have a budget of $15,000, which is exactly my point here. One might understand when reading this comic that this is inspired not just by the Mario franchise, but by a bunch of Disney and Cartoon Network story arc shows from the 2010s. Although I appreciate Yves dreaming about making his own stuff with that Steven Universe and Adventure Time flair, the problem is he has a lot of limitations that he needs to get past in order to make a story arc comic like this one work. The problem is, without a crew, which is what all these other animated works I've mentioned a few minutes earlier needed in order to solve these limitations, and Yves doesn't even have one. This is exactly the point I'm trying to make. Yves should have made this into an animated series if you really wanted to make a story arc out of these characters. Yes, I know the project would be fan-made, and it's not affiliated with Nintendo, as well as the animation industry in Los Angeles collapsing over the years. But so what? Why not just make an indie series out of it? After all, the budgets would be so much smaller in Quebec, where he lives, than working in a major television studio in Los Angeles. And you would also be able to get a crew and to help you make your Mario fan works even better. Even if it's totally not pocket change, you might as well work on making a series than putting all the story arc content in a comic that is filled to the brim with limitations. Especially since cartoons now like the Amazing Digital Circus exist. So what's the problem with not making an indie cartoon on this? You guys know what I mean? Anyways, to conclude, I think The Three Little Princesses is a very middle-of-the-road comic. It's definitely not the worst fan project I've seen. After all, 99% of those Loud House fanfiction on DeviantArt from 2017 or 2018 are far worse than this comic. But you can find a lot of better Mario fan comics online, as this one just didn't age well. Now, before I wrap up this video, I just want to say one more thing. If you guys are interested in checking out Jay's video on why this comic is the worst Mario fan comic ever, I just have to say just to probably not watch it. At least before you read it. And this is not because I hate Jay or because I'm not on his side. It's just that this is one of those things I feel like people have to read it themselves in order to formulate their own opinion. I just think that people should not be watching other people's reviews on these comics because I assume this will be one of those things where 50% of the people say it sucks and 50% of them are going to say it's good. And I don't want to show any toxic negativity or toxic positivity on this comic, even though I said that this is not one of Jay's better videos. I do suggest to check out some of his other content on YouTube because all in all, he is a good reviewer, but this was just his weakest video from the channel due to all the toxic negativity promoted and only being there because he has beef with the creator. I feel like other people who do not know about this comic should read it in order to figure out if it's good or bad, because let's be honest, everyone is different and I cannot speak for everyone and neither can Jay. Well, everyone, that was quite the video to make. I gotta say, I may have taken a little while longer than expected to complete this video, but I need to get it off my chest because while Jay is a good reviewer as a whole and I like his videos, I don't think this was a good review at all. It was a very weak one. And as I said before, I think you should just take my words from this review and read the comic yourself if you're really that interested in it and make your own opinion without the help of anyone else. But anyways, that's all for this video. I got a lot of stuff to plan for 2025 and I hope to get all my other videos out as soon as possible. But for now, see you next time.